and he wants to know what changed between the Old Testament giving and the New Testament giving.
Yeah, well, that's an important question, also a pretty variegated question. I mean, the short answer is the theocracy went away. I think that's probably the easiest place to start. I mean, on my website, I think for anybody who's listening and interested in the subject of giving and tithing, if you go to drmsh.com and put in the word tithing, that's Tithing, you're going to get to a blog post where I have links to a 2-part article series on tithing that I think is really well done. So that would give you the details of what I'm gonna say here. Not the 2 articles aren't things that I've written, but they're written by somebody else. I just think it covers really all the bases and does a good job of it. You know, once you have the theocracy gone, that affects a lot because the tithing system of the Old Testament was meant to maintain the priesthood of this whole theocratic system that we think of as ancient Israel. You know, when the temple goes out, I was going to say out the window, but when the temple, burns down, it's gone. And now there's still a priesthood around, but there were certain parts of the tithing system that were linked to certain things you did in the temple. Okay, that's going to naturally change things. When the temple was rebuilt, I mean, it's not quite what it was in Solomon's day. You don't have political independence. You don't have political autonomy like you did under the days of David and Solomon. A lot of the Old Testament laws about tithing certain resources, just went with a certain lifestyle, a certain way of life that was geared to having a country, having that country run from a city, having a monarchy, having a temple. All of that gets shuffled and changed, with the loss of a temple and the loss of a theocratic way of life. Now you still have, people in synagogues, like after the temple is destroyed, you have the synagogue system develop. You had people teaching in the synagogues, and they, could still expect, I think, both culturally and scripturally, that the idea of supporting those kinds of people, especially if they are still in the role of a priest, even though what they do now is somewhat limited, again, in the absence of a temple, or the same kind of system and setup, they still have the right to be supported and maintained. This is the way it was just generally in the ancient Near East. This is how priests lived. Their livelihood came from contributions, sacrifices, maybe contributions of land or physical goods, metals, whatever. This is how they lived. Now in the New Testament era, again, when the whole people of God moves away from having an ethnic identity and a theocratic identity, so to now we're including Gentiles in the very fabric of the people of God. In the New Testament era, according to what the New Testament says, everybody's a priest, priesthood of the believer. So by definition, that just doesn't conform, to the Old Testament system. And this is in part why you don't have a carryover in the New Testament of the tithing language or the system of the Old Testament. Now, Paul, though, taught that he had the right to this kind of support as a servant of God. I mean, he didn't take it. He decided, to do tent making, to support himself. But he does remind, readers, like in the epistles to the Corinthians, that he, as an apostle, he could have demanded, this sort of thing and would have had, ground to stand on, so to speak. But he doesn't do that. Again, that's in place, even though it's not a priestly model so much like the Israelite culture, the Israelite system, what we read in the Hebrew Bible. There's just this presupposition that servants of God, just generally, should be supported by the believing community. If you think about the Old Testament, there is this sort of system of support outside the direct theocratic, monarchical sort of situation. The prophets, for instance. Okay, there's no you're not going to read in the Torah about specific tithes going to prophets. The prophets were something different. They were people raised up during the days of the monarchy, the united monarchy or the divided monarchy, again to God raising up essentially covenant enforcers. That's what prophets were. They would preach to people about being loyal to God, loyal to the covenant, and all that sort of thing. Well, those people, just culturally, it was assumed that somebody's going to support them. Elijah, had the situation with the widow and the room and board, and all that kind of stuff. There were people in the community that would contribute to recognized individuals that were considered to speak for God, and that's kind of what Paul's drawing on as well. You had Isaiah, who was sort of a prophet of the royal court. That was a little bit different. He's probably getting some support from the monarchy itself, at that point. But what I'm pointing to is there's just this assumption in Scripture, and by example, the legitimizing of the assumption that servants of God should be supported by the community. So broadly speaking, that's intact, even if the theocratic, tithing system is not. Even though that doesn't survive from Old and New Testament, the general idea does. This gets muddied a little bit in the New Testament because in the New Testament, all the passages that pastors like to use to convince people that they should be tithing, if you actually look at those passages, let's just use what happens in the book of Acts and Paul. Paul is going around collecting money for the saints in Jerusalem. Okay, you don't actually have this weekly giving system for individual churches. Paul doesn't go into a church and start preaching tithing for that church. Wherever he goes, apparently, because he brings it up a lot, there's this notion of, hey, you sister churches here that I'm starting and that I started, or that I'm in your presence now. All of this, the gospel, started back with Jesus and the disciples, and there's this Jerusalem church that's notoriously poor. They're under persecution all the time, and it's pretty big, so that kind of compounds the problem. He takes up collections for them, for an altogether different church. And that's actually what you see described in the New Testament. You don't have a new tithing system for individual local churches laid out. You have this general assumption that the laborer is worthy of his hire, but then the actual giving passages are really for this one church back in Jerusalem. So you don't have a whole lot of scriptural structure for this. But what happens is, well, the Old Testament's in our Bible, and so we're going to preach tithing, even though that was Israel and the theocracy and the priesthood, even though we don't have that. And I understand that, but I think we're better off, and I think this is what the New Testament actually does, is it teaches the principle of giving. It teaches that the laborer is worthy of his hire, and you should give cheerfully. You should give sacrificially. It's not about a certain percentage. You should contribute and give what you can. And you know what you can. You know what sacrificial is. You know what, you know whether you're sort of not doing your part or whether you are. And the New Testament leaves that up to the individual, but it lays down the principle of cheerful giving, sacrificial giving, and the labor being worthy of his hire. It doesn't worry about strict percentages like we had in the theocratic system. So there really are no New Testament rules about tithing, but there are very clear principles about the Lord's servants being supported. It's just that we don't have this strict percentage system layout like we do in the Old Testament.